Namaste everyone, I am Dr. Pallavi Kasande and I welcome you all to this module. Today we are going to discuss Plato's philosophy and his various psychological concepts and thoughts. This is the part 1 of Plato's module. In this part, we are going to discuss his brief history and basic concepts of psyche. So, let us begin. There will be no end to the troubles of states or indeed of humanity itself, till philosophers become kings in this world or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers. Plato said this in 427 years BC, before Christ era, but when I read it, I felt, oh, it's true even today. I shared this thought with few of my friends and colleagues and they also expressed the same. Philosophy is the origin of all sciences because it is not merely a subject but an approach of studying any subject under the sky in depth and with different dimensions. So, let us start to understand Plato's approach towards human mind, human behavior from his philosophical point of view. Let us have a look at his life journey first. Plato was born in 428 before Christ era and he died in 348 era in Athens, which is the city of Greece. He was an ancient Greek philosopher, one of the students of Socrates, the teacher of Aristotle and the founder of the Plato's Academy. He was also best known as the author of philosophical works of unparalleled influence. Plato's family was aristocratic and distinguished in the city. He was the son of Ariston, whose family was claimed descent from Greek god Poseidon. Now, god Poseidon was the god of sea, earthquakes and horses in Greek culture. Plato's mother Perioton was from a family which was in power in 403 years before Christ era. They were among those dictators who restored and ruled democracy in Athens. Though Plato was from a very rich family, he was a philosopher from his young age. In the initial years of his career, he joined a circle of Socrates' followers. He was a thorough scholar and disciple, believer of Socrates' philosophy. His early work is often referred as Socratic work. Plato was profoundly affected by both the life and the death of Socrates. The activity of the older man provided the starting point of Plato's philosophy. We all know that the Greek philosopher Socrates was convicted guilty by the Athenian court. Socrates willingly accepted death by drinking poison. His sin was his philosophy about the soul, that the soul is immortal. The treatment given to Socrates by the court made Plato distrustful about public life. After the death of Socrates in 380 before Christ era, Plato founded an university, academy. It was an influential center of research and learning. It attracted many philosophers and scholars of outstanding ability. The great Greek philosopher Aristotle was also the part of his academy for 20 years. After the death of Plato, he started his own school of thought. Plato wrote Republic, Duality of Psyche and some 31 philosophical dialogues. At that time, he was considered one of the most significant thinkers of ancient times. Now, let us understand Plato's thoughts and concepts in psychology. Plato used storytelling method in his literature to illustrate points about the psyche. In his story of the charioteer in Phaedrus, it is a philosophical dialogue. Plato linked the human being to a chariot team. For example, Plato wanted to explain conflict between on reason, emotion and drive. Now he wrote like this: imagine a charioteer who wants to control both the horses of his chariot. The story goes like this: there is a powerful unruly horse intent on having its own way at all costs. Here the horse's appetite means emotions. The other horse is thoroughbred, spirited but manageable. Now this horse is like a spirit, that is drive. So here two horses are having two different goals. Now if with these two horses the charioteer wants to select a particular path, then what will happen? Plato has explained this like this: on catching sight of his beloved, the charioteer, that means reason, attempts with some difficulty to direct the two horses towards the goal, which he alone without horses can comprehend. It means the person, his soul can do everything without any hurdle, but he has to carry a body with emotions and drives. So the person has to handle both and has to achieve his goal with lots of difficulties, because emotions and drives are different. The example shows that Plato presents dualism of the psyche. It means there are two parts of psyche, one is body and the other one is soul. Now what is the concept of psyche? Compared to the industry of papers on books on Aristotle, the output on Plato is relatively limited, especially on his general view of soul and body. Plato invented the idea of mind as the broad concept of psyche, which means basically a life principle. For Plato, the soul is not only what animates and moves the body, but also does the thinking. Hence, the soul is characterized and differentiated from the body by its cognitive and kinetic capabilities. It must be abstract to some extent in order to contemplate abstract ideas, and it must have a dynamic nature in order to account for motion and action. He says that everybody seeks good and knowledge is sufficient for attainment of good. Why one fails to achieve good is not because of weakness, but due to his ignorance. Now let us talk about nature of psyche. Plato says that human beings have two separate parts of psyche, body and soul. Death means the separation of soul from his body, and the soul also strives to get separation from disturbance of body because it cares for knowledge. The soul is immortal. To prove this, he presents four arguments. The first argument: the soul is bearer of life as well as death. It knows everything. He calls this life principle. Second, the soul takes birth again and again and can contemplate this form. He calls it cognitive principle. Third, the forms of soul are invisible. They are constant and indestructible. The fourth, the soul is not a form, but because of its special relation to form, it is either alive or alternatively a form copy. Plato concludes that the soul is both cognitive and a live soul. Now there are three aspects of soul according to Plato. Both Plato and Aristotle divide the soul into specific number of parts. Plato divides soul into three parts. He calls it tripartite division of soul. Plato has developed these three parts on the basis of Pythagoras' idea about three lifestyles. The first lifestyle is of a philosopher's lifestyle, where the goal is wisdom. The second lifestyle is of man of action, where the goal is being distinct from others. third lifestyle is of a votary or a follower whose goal is just a gratification of appetite. By following this principle, Plato divided the soul into three types, that is appetitive soul, the spirited soul and the rational soul. This argument for Plato's tripartite division of the soul is based on his notion of the ideal city, in which he assumes that there are three kinds of citizens: guardians, auxiliary forces and artisans. Plato believes that there is an isomorphic relation between the city and in the soul, in that they both have three parts which correspond to each other. Thus, Plato develops analogy between the soul and the city. According to Plato, the three parts of the soul are the rational, spirited and appetitive parts. The rational part corresponds to the guardians, in that it performs the executive function in a soul just as it does in a city. The spirited part corresponds to the military or auxiliary forces, because it is expected to display the virtue of courage, and the appetitive part corresponds to the banker or artisans, who are only concerned with pleasure. Plato presents another analogy to illustrate the relationship between the parts of the soul, which we have discussed earlier, in the form of story, where the charioteer is attempting to drive two horses. One horse is of pure breed and the other of shameful breed. The horse of pure breed corresponds to the spirited element, since it obeys the reason and does not need to be beaten. The other horse corresponds to appetitive element, since it requires the belt in order to obey reason. It means the reason is and should take control of both spirited and appetitive soul. We can relate this theory to Freud's theory of id, ego and superego, where id is appetitive soul, ego is rational soul and superego is spirited soul. Plato believes that the rational soul results into wisdom, the appetitive soul results into temperance and spirited soul results into courage. The harmony or balance in these three results into justice. But for that, the rational soul should take charge of other two souls. Plato says that human beings are basically good, but these good people are rational, which drive towards virtue. Plato also presents his views on virtue, true happiness, sufferings and personality. Now, we will discuss this in the next part of this module. To conclude this part, Plato was a great Greek philosopher in around 427 years BC. He was from a noble family, but devoted his life for study of psychology and philosophy. We find major influence of Socrates and his philosophy on Plato. After Socrates' death, Plato started his own school, that is academy, which was a modern university at that period. He presented dualism of soul and body and also presented tripartite division of soul. Thank you.